Hello, everybody. So this week we will be talking about gardening and agriculture. And I guess I want to start off with my experience with gardening. Can't say I have too much personal experience with agriculture, but maybe it's sort of related. But I feel like agriculture is a little bit like bigger picture. But as far as gardening goes, I recently planted two pepper plants, one for bell peppers and one for chili peppers. Recently was, I guess, half a year ago now. It was sometime in November. Um, it wasn't really the best time to start growing these plants that would bear fruit, right? In the into the fall, towards the start of the winter. Um, but yeah, I mean, they were very exciting to grow. They're basically the first plants that I've ever grown, like myself, or even like any live plants I've kind of had around the house. So when I was growing up, my parents never really had any like live plants. I guess it was just not something that interested them. I mean, we had plants outside in our garden that were kept up by whoever, like the same people who kept up our like pool and stuff. So I don't know. There were certainly plants outside, but we never really did anything with them. Um, and no plants that like my parents were ever like responsible for. And so yeah, when like it first sprouted, that was like super exciting because like it was something that like I had planted, I had sown, right, and then I was starting to reap something. It was very exciting to actually like grow a living thing. Like my parents also like they're very anti-pets, so like it's kind of like in general around the household there wasn't very much like life outside of I guess the people. I mean, we had a lot of fake plants, so that was like I don't know, kind of dumb in retrospect. There was like a lot of fake plants, so like that was sort of all around the house. Um, so yeah, I guess that was kind of one thing I thought was cool, was like having maybe not living, breathing maybe things around the house that weren't just me and my roommates. Um, that was like one cool thing about it. It's been a little bit disappointing that they haven't grown those fruits yet. We like left it outside once, and then which is like what you're supposed to do because I think it needs actually more warmer weather. But then we like lost half of the leaves to what we think is like uh, either a bird or some squirrel or animal. Um, yeah, then we brought them back inside, and so they're like they're growing flowers and stuff, but they haven't grown any fruits yet. So I mean, there are some strategies that we looked up to try to kind of grow them, but yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of not super related, but yeah, it's been a fun experience overall gardening. And I think kind of the biggest point that I wanted to bring across was like kind of, I mean, it's sort of related to growing plants and growing pet and like having pets, sorry, like at home, like having life at home, right? More than just the people in it. I think there's something nice about that I think I've only recently started to explore, I guess. That was kind of my take on this prompt. I know that this prompt was actually originally um, Kevin's idea, and so I kind of stole it from him. I don't know. Maybe Kevin could also talk a little bit about, I guess, his thoughts on the prompt.
Well, um, so for me, the gardening experience was had a slightly more agricultural twist, just because it really came through my grandmother. Um, Throughout middle school and high school, when she was living with us, I mean, she'd be the only one kind of home during the day because everyone else had stuff to do, right? So she kept up a pretty large garden. Like she took over all four sides of the yard, and there's stuff growing in all of those things. So, like every year, once it started getting towards the summer months, I'd come home from school and then I'd see her working in the yard, and she'd be like, "Can you help me do some miscellaneous task?" Right? And I just like, okay, sure, let me go do that, right? So sometimes it would be like watering things, sometimes it'd be like cutting off the fruit that was born, and sometimes it would be like putting in the her homemade fertilizer. That I usually try to avoid because it smelled super bad. Like she would get this bottle of like the tea stuff that they sell, like 1 liter jugs. She'd fill it with water and like beans, and then like get like a whole fermenting thing going. And so she was really into it, right? So by the time it would get so late summer into the early fall, like like the particular plant we grew, I feel like something was like that's definitely not representative, but it just wouldn't stop bearing fruit. Like, and I didn't even really like that particular plant. Like the rest of my folks or like my family like loved eating it, but like I just really didn't like it. But like it seemed like every other day a new one would be ripe, and then we'd take it off, and we just have like a stack of that plant kind of in the corner, and then like we eat it like 3 times a week, and I just really got sick of it.
What was it?
Um, it I don't know what the name is actually. It looks like a cucumber, but it's not. We also grew cucumbers, which I was fun, but yeah. And I guess the only other thing that made it, I guess, identifiable was apparently if you didn't eat it, you just kind of let it dry out. You can like peel the skin off, and then you have the center, and it's like you can use it as like a scrubber, like like you, when you do the dishes, right? You have your sponge, and then
Hmm.
for stuff that's really gunky, right? Like you'll have like a metal wool mesh sort of thing, right? Like it can kind of take that role. It
So
might
we're
be
saying
called
this
a
fruit is like that?
yes, yes, yes. It's called a
Oh.
loofah. A loofah?
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So is it like
Um,
some sort of, I guess it's some sort of sponge-like material, maybe?
that's the best I can describe it, right?
Yeah.
So that was kind of like I guess one half of kind of what I really think about when I think about gardening. The other half was a slightly more disappointing story where so my mother really likes eating sunflower seeds, so we decided we would grow some sunflowers, right, in the backyard. And yeah, so then we had these 3 big, healthy-looking sunflowers, and then by the time it got to fall, or maybe it was in the fall, but whenever we were trying to harvest them, we got close and we saw that all the sunflower seed, like you couldn't tell from far away, but it was actually completely infested with like some kind of maggot. Like they just like ate it, and they lived there. Right? It was really
Ooh.
disgusting. Right? It's just kind of like from a distance, you're like, oh, this is growing fine and everything, right? And then you get close, you're trying to like harvest things, and it's already been like taken over by some other creature, right? So I was just like thinking kind of about agriculture then, like, that must have been and probably still is a very frustrating feeling to have, right? It's kind of like everything looks pristine and nice, but the locals had some different ideas about what the fate of your produce would be.
Hmm. Okay, so I mean, yeah, I actually also had issues with bugs. Um, like there was a time when we had them inside that attracted a whole bunch of flies, and the hypothesis that we have is like these flies start to eat at the roots. Um, so we actually originally had 4 bell pepper plants, and we now only have one. But the other 3 died because when we like took out the plants, like the roots were just so weak. Like, they weren't picking up any soil, and they just looked shriveled up and like just like thin and terrible. And so yeah, we think that there are bugs that were eating our roots. And I mean, this kind of threw out the idea that maybe we should like have pesticides or something like that. So I was wondering if maybe your grandma or your family considered having pesticides, or are they trying to be like, no, we want to be organic and all. Because that was kind of like an instinct on my end. Like I was like, should we? I feel like you hear pesticide and it sounds like a bad word when you're
Well,
growing plants and stuff. But
I
family
think
members
the
are like,
thinking for our end was, well, one, my grandmother didn't like she was kind of in charge of this, and she just didn't want to bother with that. And the other thing is, if you're gonna add pesticides and everything, it just feels like you might as well just buy it from like the supermarket because they can probably do this stuff better. Um, I mean, also if you're, I guess, with parents, sometimes they're worried that since my brother and I would often go to the garden, right? They didn't want there to be pesticides all over the place. And
right, right.
like, I don't know. I don't even know if exactly there was a real risk, but that's just kind of like stay away from pesticides. Like they
Yeah.
just just overkill, right? We're not depending on these. It's just kind of like a thing.
Yeah, I don't know if they're actually that bad. I don't know. Like, I actually watched a documentary recently. It was I think I might butcher the name. It's called like the biggest small farm. Um, and so there's this like farm somewhere in the LA area where they're growing everything like super naturally, and like instead of pesticides, they'll like release some animals to, like eat the bugs, and if, like those animals become a problem, they'll like I remember they had like owls that were like eating the rats that were eating this other thing, but like some of these things were also eating like the bugs off the plants and stuff like that. Um, yeah, I mean, it said the whole thing was like the whole point was you know you can have like sustainable like large farming, I guess, um, because you know people hear that like I guess big agriculture they like maybe cut corners and they put in these pesticides and the food is worse. I don't know. Yeah, I guess I should probably do some more research as far as like is you know how much worse is putting a pesticide in? Is it actually like unhealthy, or I mean, it seems
Yeah.
useful. I don't know.
I think there are a lot of like conspiracies about, chemicals in your food and hormones and GMOs and things like that. But I also feel like the kind of large scale, low cost food supply that we have can't exist if every farm is trying to emulate what they're doing in this one farm in Los Angeles, right? Um, I mean, genetically modified plants and crops and pesticides and insecticides are like essential to us having food, right, in every grocery store and on every person's table at such a low cost that anyone can afford it. So, yeah, I mean, like, you should do your research, but I've always been of the mind that generally, if we want to maintain, the level of food accessibility we have, then we have to, go beyond natural means and natural methods to achieve it.
I think
Oh, go ahead.
I was saying, like, I think one kind of underlying concept kind of surrounding this whole conspiracy, as you were saying, is kind of on a first level a disconnect between kind of what's being done kind of on the ground, so to speak, and kind of the people making comments, and then kind of following on with that kind of like maybe a distrust. So let me like walk through kind of exactly what I mean there. It's so like for for me, right, like in my gardening experience, right, helping out, right, I was already one level removed because guys, I wasn't really in charge of things. Like I would be asked to help out, right? And it was fun, but like again, we didn't depend on the food. So that's why it's kind of like we thought and pesticides were, maybe not necessary, right? We weren't really super attached to it one way or another. If we could get some fruit, that's cool. If we can't, who cares, right? It's probably a very different feeling for not only farmers today, but like when people way back in ancient history started doing agriculture, right? Because like, the calculus, it does matter to their livelihoods, right? So like the choice about making whether or not they put pesticides when they're available, right? Like taking those measures to like cull the wildlife and whatnot and like protect their crops. It was a much more personal thing to them back then, right? And so, a lot of us today might, have opinions about, hey, we want to make it sustainable, kind of respect the wildlife, right? Like, that makes sense kind of from our kind of removed perspective. So, but to someone who's like spending day in, day out toiling in the fields, trying to like grow these crops, right? It's understandably a much more adversarial relationship between them and the wildlife, right? Whether it's like large animals or small bugs that are like trying to basically cash in on their hard work, right? So kind of add to that the kind of reverse disconnect where in the present day where we have like large production food, right? Because they've been pretty successful at warding off the wildlife. When people make decisions about pesticides and sustainability, kind of it's a little bit more detached, right? Like I've seen like people kind of describe a sentiment where it's kind of like the farmers, they only do these pesticide things or whatnot because they're not the ones eating it. They're kind of like just selling it to faceless people, and we don't care about their livelihoods or nothing, right? So it's just kind of like the fact that kind of there's this disconnect in society where like a group of people, like a big portion of the society, has kind of moved away from like agriculture and that world and those considerations, and then there's like a part of society that's kind of very much still, that's like their everyday life, right? Like that disconnect and kind of what's important, what's right, what's wrong, that, and the kind of like a, I don't want to go necessarily to the point of distrust, but it's kind of like one side always seems to feel like, oh, you don't know what's like going on, right? It's just kind of not very looking at them as like a equal for dialogue, and that can cause a lot of angst, I feel.
Well, yeah, and I think the overarching source of friction, especially among those who are like skeptics of GMOs and the practices of the agriculture industry, is the corporatization of it, right? Like, I mean, the kind of classic American farmer who has like a red barn and lives with his family on a farm or something doesn't really exist anymore, right? What we have are like large like corporate farm operations where they own thousands of acres, or they have some sort of network of like farmers that they do business with, and there's like an overarching like corporate background to it. There's a structure, and I think like in any industry like healthcare or education or whatever, the presence of like this profit making motive and these large faceless corporations who are kind of unaccountable because they're run by CEOs or boards who you don't know the names of and who are worth billions of dollars. It's it makes people suspicious, right? Because the ultimate, kind of like what you're saying, they're not really the ones eating the food, so their incentive is just to make as much money as possible. And I think that has led to some pretty disastrous environmental and public health problems in the past. So, like on one hand, like there needs to be a healthy skepticism and like accountability for this industry that most of us living in cities don't know about, yet rely on every day. But I also think, there are some people who go too far in saying, oh, we need to go back to this organic sort of, agrarian past where we did everything naturally, because, the entire process of agriculture, the science of it, is none of it's natural, right? Like, I mean, anything humans do that manipulates plants, even just a simple act of like putting crops in rows and irrigating them, that's not natural,
Mm-hmm.
It's not how plants naturally grow. So it's always gonna be an intervention in the natural order of nature, and to a large extent, we have to accept that if we want to, have food to eat.
Yeah. So I feel like on the one hand, one effect of this corporatization is, I guess the impact on the plants, like we were talking about pesticides and all sorts of things that I guess you do to the plants that like I guess make them grow more and stuff like that. But I guess maybe another point that I feel like is kind of more emotionally rousing for some people is like the treatment of animals by these corporate agrarian companies. And like, I mean, there's always you go to the market and like there's like farm raised food versus I guess non-farm raised animal meat. So I guess like it sounded like the three of us are maybe a little bit more okay with like pesticides in our food, right? Because it's kind of like, well, pesticides, GMOs, it's kind of what you need to do to grow these plants. But if we're treating animals poorly, I mean, that could, there's like PETA, right? That like it's all up in arms about this. I guess I'm wondering what you guys think about, on the one hand, corporatization leads to like, maybe a poorer treatment of plants, but like who really cares? But then when it comes to animals, maybe that's a different question. I was wondering.
Are you talking about livestock, or are you talking about? Okay. I was wondering in case you're talking about kind of the wildlife that's displaced, or like the targets of our pesticide, for instance.
No. I'm talking about livestock, and like, because I mean, they get raised in a very like robotic, machine-like way, right? Like they get kind of put in this like a factory almost, right? And so I guess does that? I mean, because like I mentioned, it seemed like our response to pesticides and GMOs is kind of like, yeah, it's whatever. It's what you got to do, right? But with farm animals and livestock, what do you guys think?
I mean, I think the question of animal rights, like the moral and philosophical issue surrounding that, is like not something I've really given like much intense thought to, partially because I'm kind of afraid of those questions, right? As a meat eater, someone who really enjoys meat and has it like with every meal. um, I follow like a couple of accounts on Twitter that are vegan and are pretty, they post about like the reasoning behind their beliefs, and a lot of the questions about like the ethics of factory farming and how we treat these animals are really difficult to answer, or it's hard to defend the practice of eating meat, right? um, like I remember there's one framing that's like, even if you value an animal's life at 1/10,000th of a human's, the scale of factory farming makes it that this is a worse like atrocity than the Holocaust every single year, right? Um, and I don't know, like, how do we value that? Is it that like an animal's life is 1/1,000,000th of a human's, or is it just that like there's such different species that there's no comparison when it comes to value, and we just don't place any value on animal lives? Should we? And we're running out of excuses, right? We now have not only like cheap, plentiful vegetables and fruits, but we also have meat alternatives and fake meat that is pretty much equivalent to the real thing, right? You go and eat an Impossible Burger at Burger King, and it tastes like a regular burger, right? So I don't know. I think I feel hypocritical when I'm confronted with these questions, and I don't know how to process them, because you're kind of going up against your like gut, like primal instinct to eat meat, right? It's like a evolutionary thing,
I mean, like, I've always thought about it kind of as, between, well, kind of not look at what humans do for a moment, right? But like what other animals do to each other, like just on account of survival, right? Like there are omnivores other than ourselves, right? They could choose between eating plants and eating other creatures that move, right? Um, it just kind of, to me, it starts sounding more and more ridiculous when you have to ask the question, well, when do we draw the line? When does it okay to kill something else for your own gain, right? Like for I think for most people, it's pretty easy to say you're not supposed to kill another person for your own gain, right? But kind of which I don't find particularly controversial, is just kind of going further beyond that. It's like, okay, so let's say we can't raise livestock for the purpose of killing them and eating them, right? But then what about the wildlife that kind of attacks our plant crops, right? Should we kind of just yield our yields to them, or kind of is it okay to use pesticides to kill the bugs because they're alive too, right? That same argument about like how much do we value bug life? It's like, as long as you put some non-zero value on it, right, we're probably doing worse than the Holocaust already, right? Like, but then you're kind of like, well, they're bugs, right? And let's say bugs are something like, I grew my sunflowers, right? Like, I was gonna have some sunflower seeds, but the bug's gonna eat them. I see two problems here. Well, one, the bugs are eating the sunflowers, right? Now the sunflower is getting eaten by another creature that's not me, right? And then kind of moreover, do we stop at what about plants in general, right? Like we're kind of growing plants to eat them, and then like I just feel like it's hard to pin down a good point to stop and draw the line, and that to me signals that the whole thought exercise is kind of silly because it's just kind of like there's no clear way to stop, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say there's no like quantitative way or empirical way to set the line, right? It's all socially constructed. You know, like right now in America, we've socially decided collectively that dogs and cats are not acceptable to eat. You know, and that line is completely arbitrary. It's not based on anything but emotion. You know, um, but I think the debate will continue simply because it's such like a political and fluid question, right? It all depends on public opinion. The public thinks that cows are, you know, worthy of living, then the public will move the line. Which is why I think vegans fight so hard in organizations like PETA and everything, because they know that they can like mold the public discussion and, you know, create some really significant change in the way that we like farm animals and eat them. You know, it's all open for debate.
Right. So, and I think you hit on a very core issue here, which is it is really just a matter of opinion, right? So so that's why, like, when people kind of try to raise it to a moral, ethical level, I find that somewhat absurd, right? Because, I mean, I guess you can still have opinions about morals and ethics, right?
Oh, yeah,
But
that's what I was about to say.
right, but I feel like if compared with an opinion about just kind of things in general versus opinion about morals and ethics, right? It's much easier for someone to say, well, your opinion is wrong when it comes to morals and ethics than it is when it's just kind of like, what's your favorite color, right? Like, so I feel like, you know, in the realm of opinions, that opinions about the treatment of other living entities than ourselves, I would only draw the line at humans just because it's kind of like, well, why? I probably want to think carefully about why I draw the line at humans, but kind of my point was more that like we shouldn't kind of like, well, I don't think it's meaningful to try and like go around and like on a witch hunt saying that, oh, because you and I draw the lines differently, then somehow your morals are weaker than mine, or things like that. Like, I've encountered folks who kind of like doing that. I just think it's really unnecessary.
But isn't that like all of politics? Is really just that over and over again between every single person.
Well, so I feel like a lot of politics does end up turning into situations where you kind of like going on a witch hunt and trying to identify the undesirables in society, right?
Well,
For
maybe
whatever reason,
not the
right?
witch hunt part, but like the, you know, your morals are different than mine, and that makes your position worse, or, you know, the disagreement over where to draw the line on any issue, you know.
Right. So, okay, and that's fine. We don't have to go to the point of a witch hunt, right? But the one is kind of like trying to, I guess, draw lines within the population, right? It's like, you feel this way, I feel differently, so we're gonna have to argue and like, you know, just like, you know, think less of the other side on account of these things, right? Whereas I feel like kind of the necessity of politics is just so that it's kind of a word we use to describe the process by which people try to find ways to get along, right? And in that sense, like, I feel like the goal of politics should be just to organize people to live, to coexist kind of peacefully, right? Like, that should be the goal. It should be to, in some ways, to unite rather than to divide, right? Like, that's how I view, in theory, right, what politics should be able to achieve. What I see end up happening in reality a lot of times is people divide the larger group in order to unite smaller groups, right? Because people a lot of times really like to subscribe to a them versus us sort of thing, right? So by creating a divide at the macro level, you create solidarity at a smaller micro level.
So I guess I don't know, when I first brought up this question of animal treatment, like, I mean, I feel like maybe you guys are thinking this in terms of like whether we should kill the animal or should not kill the animal. Like, I guess when Justin mentioned like if we value an animal's life at one 1,000th or whatever number as a fraction of a human life, and it's what's the Holocaust. But like, I guess what I was wondering is more along the lines of like how we treat the animals, like as they are, bred to be ultimately slaughtered. I guess like there are rules and regulations regarding like I think there are, right, at least like how much space like an animal should have like as it's born and grown to ultimately be slaughtered, and like I guess just the general treatment of animals, and like I guess I love my plants, and so maybe I mean I'm ultimately going to be eating the fruit off of them hopefully if they grow off well, but like I don't know, do you think I just how important is that to you guys as far as how you think about this issue, like the treatment of the animals? Like I mentioned, there's farm, you go to the supermarket and there's like farm raised versus the other type that I don't know if they don't call them like factory raised or anything. That's kind of like how the documentaries paint them, right? Like they get, they're just these warehouses where these cows live or something, and then they ultimately get slaughtered. And so I mean, I guess for me, like whether or not they're killed is not so much the question, I guess. I mean, which is a little odd to say. I mean, that seems like it would be the real moral like sin if we are to call one, like if we're gonna use that word. But like I don't know how important the treatment of the animals is. It was kind of what I wanted to get at originally.
Yeah, I don't really put any stock in it. I mean, I'll be honest. I buy the cheapest possible like meat, eggs, whatever. I shop at Aldi, right? So, it's not Whole Foods. It's very far from that. And I certainly don't see any advertising on the packaging that indicates that there was any humane treatment of the animals before they were killed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I mean, it's another one of those uncomfortable questions, but
yeah,
I think for me, I really put a higher value on value than what's happening behind the scenes, and that's probably just out of a willful ignorance of the process. Even though I've watched documentaries like you have, and I've seen the horrific conditions and everything. I think for most Americans, it's just like at the end of the day, you go to the grocery store and you want to spend a certain amount of money, and that's the process.
The free market.
Yes, all its ugliness. Yeah.
I think it goes back to that whole detached thing I was saying earlier, right? Like,
yeah.
If it was your cow, right? Like, and you watched this cow kind of like grow up from a little cow to a big cow, right? And you milked it every day. And then all of a sudden, someone is like, here, let me pay you X dollars to take this cow off your hands. You'll still get your milk. It's like, wait, why? It's like, oh, we have this super fancy factory that can do this super efficiently, right? And then you just see your cow plugged into this giant machine.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you have that attachment, right? But for a lot of folks who've never been on a farm their whole life, it's just kind of like, I want eggs. Do I want the expensive eggs, or do I want the cheap eggs?
And they taste the same, I swear.
They taste the same, right? Like, you could pay more for the same thing, or you could like say, oh, but these eggs were obtained in a process by which the producers of the eggs were presumably in less pain, right? Like, you really have to kind of invest yourself in that idea, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And then on top of that, you have to have the kind of the luxury to choose, right? Because if it's kind of like, well, I could buy these better eggs, but that means I can't buy the milk, and then we're kind of like worse off, right? It's just kind of like, I think this response in some ways is a bit of a cop-out, right? It's kind of more or less boiling down to, it's like, gosh, are you seriously putting this on the priority list of kind of things you have to worry about, right? But it's kind of like, some of us were in a position to choose, right? It just kind of like, and does that make it wrong to make a choice? I don't think it makes it wrong. It's just, I do feel like that's sometimes the resistance that people have to it. It's kind of like, it's almost like we're living in different worlds, right? It's kind of like, why have you created all this emotional attachment to this thing, when I think for a large number of people that attachment doesn't exist as a default, unless, again, it's the cow you raised, right? It's just kind of like the amount of exposure you've had to specific.
Yeah. All right. Um, well, I guess moving on. I don't know. I feel Kevin and I both shared our personal relationships with gardening and agriculture, and so
Yeah.
I'm gonna put the spotlight on Justin. Ask if you have ever
Um,
grown plants, or milked a cow, or
I've not
what's
done
your
that, no.
relationship with gardening and agriculture?
Well, I have never successfully grown a plant. Even like just a shelf, little thing, they always die.
Mhm.
So yeah, I feel pretty disconnected from agriculture. Gardening, on the other hand, was a pretty big part of my household when I lived with my parents as a kid. There was a long phase in which my mom was very into gardening, and she, we used to go down to the local, what would you call it, flower shop, nursery, I guess. I don't know, or plant store. It was called Cornelius, and yeah, we used to go down there a lot, especially during the peak of her like gardening interest, and go and buy a ton of flowers in the spring so she could plant them. Because Houston has a 10-month growing season, which is like the longest I think in the U.S., probably next to Florida. Um, so really, you can have your flowers last a long time. And yeah, my mom got really into it, and she like redid the entire front like garden, like facing the street and to a lesser extent the backyard. At one point, our house won like Garden of the Month in the neighborhood, and it was a sign on the
Wow.
lawn. Yeah, like
That's
so that was
awesome.
cool. Yeah, but she took a lot of pride in like picking out these flowers and arranging them and having like a variety of colors. Um, and it was very aesthetically pleasing. So yeah, definitely. But I don't know. I was never really like directly involved in it. I didn't really help or anything.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, but I mean, I think it's interesting. People definitely use their gardens as like an expression of something. I don't know if it's like an artistic sort of outlet where you can like design your own, space that everyone can see from the street, or if it's like a symbol of like um, wealth, maybe that you have the time and money to do your garden, so you do it nicely. Um, it's probably a bit of both. Yeah.
Mhm.
My grandmother also is really into gardening. She grows like her own fruits in her backyard in Australia. So, uh, you know, I was always impressed by that. But for me, I don't know. I don't have much affinity for the natural
Yeah.
world. So,
Wait, so what kind of plants did you try growing?
um, I don't know. Like we've had, every now and then you get gifted like a plant or a flower or something in a little pot, and you kind of try and keep it alive, and then you forget and it dies.
Yeah.
At one point, I know we tried to plant like a lime tree in the backyard, which we got at that gardening store, Cornelius.
Mhm.
um, and that was not very successful. It, primarily because I was excited to buy it, but then like when it came to actually taking care of it and getting it to grow limes, that was a different question.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so my limited efforts in gardening have not paid off.
Yeah. No, I like the distinction you drew between gardening and agriculture, like kind of at the beginning of your story. So like you mentioned, yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about it. Like, you can garden without expecting to grow food, right? You can garden and
Yes, yes,
right
yeah,
just because it looks nice, right? Like
yeah,
for that simple reason, because it looks nice, almost like
yeah,
that's it, right? And so, but I guess you can also have gardens that are meant to grow food, right? Um, I guess
yeah.
like types of gardens.
But like if you're like driving around a suburb, very few people are growing food in their front yards.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But Kevin, I feel like when he thinks of gardening, it seems like he thinks of his grandma growing sponges and cucumbers. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I definitely don't think of gardening. The word gardening is not utilitarian, right? It's all about like presentation to
Mm.
me.
That's why I attached agriculture kind of at
Yeah,
the end, right? Because I understood that again, for a lot of us, our relationship with plants and nature is no longer subsistence based, right? Like I don't live off the land. I live off of the system that we've created, where I could just go to the supermarket and have that taken care of for me, right? So for a lot of us, that our relationship with nature is purely aesthetic, right? And I think that can be a source of kind of like emotional attachment to kind of like respecting nature, right? Kind of like preserving its kind of pristine look and beauty, right? Because again, like I've become detached from that subsistence relationship, right? And so now personally, I've never done gardening with the purpose of like, I just like the way it looks, right? Like everything that I get excited about for gardening is always like, oh, we're growing an orange tree in the backyard. Okay, we're gonna have oranges in the future, right? It's like, oh, we're growing cucumbers. Great, I can make cucumber salad, right? Like it's always about that. Like there's just something that excites me about kind of putting effort into something and ending up with more than what I started. Like it's that process of cultivation that really motivates me, because otherwise I just feel like the flowers, right? They're so transient. Like they're beautiful for a while and just gone. I feel like I end up with less than I had before because otherwise,
unless you win Garden of the Month.
Yeah, see, that's permanent.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, for like a competition sort of sake, right? Just to kind of as an aside, I know this isn't strictly agriculture, but I heard a funny story the other day. It was not exactly my neighbor, but like in a different little compound area just nearby, right? Apparently, that family, um, the father's really into guns, and he kind of his children, he has a son and a daughter, are kind of also kind of excited about it, but he doesn't want to buy them like actual guns, so he bought them like airsoft, or I don't know if the airsoft is air guns, whatever. It's just like not actual guns, but like they pack a punch, right? So he gives it to his son, and what his son does is he'll go to the second floor window, and then he'll look out into kind of the open field, and he noticed there are a bunch of gophers. And then so he just decides to start taking pot shots at the gophers. Right? And that thing's really loud. And I guess so some people got worried, right? And they were like, "Oh, is this like a gun, like a shooter person, like going nuts around here?" The cops come in. And it's like, okay, sir, can you call your child over? So calls his daughter over. It's like, no, not this one, your other kid. It's like, my first reaction, how did you know it was he had another kid? It's like, well, obviously the little girl would not be the shooter, but I guess I wanted to hone in on kind of the relationship between this boy and the gophers, right? You could take a lot of different angles on like what his treatment of kind of shooting the gophers is like, right? Kind of one initial reaction, kind of going off of the whole animal like cruelty or respect for animal life sort of thing. It's kind of the gophers are minding their own business. Like, why are you attacking them, right? Like, it's just cruel. It's just mean. But then on the flip side, when you take into the fact that this child, like, I don't think the child was trying to be cruel. I mean, I guess there are cruel children out there who like to inflict pain on other entities, but I don't think this relationship was so well thought out or like elevated to a moral level, right? He was hunting but he wasn't even hunting, right? He was just shooting it for sport. I don't think that carried any sort of disrespect necessarily, but like, do you guys feel like this would be an example of, say, just animal cruelty, or do you also feel like there's something different about it?
Well, I think you're tapping in on like a theme or a concept that really is the backdrop for this entire conversation, which is like, I think you can divide people into two camps. There's people who view nature as a tool or a bundle of resources for humans to exploit, right? And that's pretty much its only purpose. And then there's the group of people who view nature and life and other living beings as like something to be respected. That's something that humans are negotiating with and need to like coexist with, right? And these two groups are always in tension, especially in modern society. And I think they break down pretty evenly between, conservatives politically who are, willing to go and drill oil and hunt animals and have factory farms because they view, nature as this kind of God-given, bundle of goodies that humans are supposed to use for economic development. And then you have like liberals who think that our destruction of nature is immoral because nature is its own sort of, thing with rights, right, and feelings to some extent, and it deserves to be respected and kind of leveraged with.
You calling the boy a Republican? Is that?
I mean, I do think. I mean, I will say there is definitely a correlation between people who hunt and people who are Republicans, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about that. And you can see that in other countries too, like in the UK. They have this entire hunting culture, and it aligns pretty well with like this more conservative, the Conservative Party there, and these ideas about like nationality and things like that. Yeah. So
I would hesitate before. I don't know. I characterize Republicans and Democrats like that. On the one hand, I also think Democrats tend to live in cities and Republicans in less dense areas where I think they can be closer to nature. So I don't know.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of confounding factors, right?
There are. But I definitely think at least the conservative viewpoint in this country is that, and I think even like people like Sarah Palin have literally said it before, is that, God or whatever divine being gave us this planet to exploit for our own benefit. These resources, the oil in the ground and the animals on the land, are ours to use as we see fit.
Interesting.
Yeah.
See, I guess I wouldn't characterize the boy that way, like in that Sarah Palin way. I feel like the boy was acting more out of ignorance. The boy was just having fun, right? And there are concerns to the boy that I guess haven't been like, I don't know, has the boy like maybe he hasn't really been exposed to this whole like animal rights issue, and like kind of like he hasn't really given his relationship with nature a second thought. He was just having fun with his gun. So I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, you may be able to fault him or his parent for that reason. For that, like, he hasn't like taught this, and so I mean, yeah. I mean, I find what he was doing to the Gophers kind of offensive. I mean, I would want to go tell the boy like, hey, maybe this isn't the right thing to do. But I don't like completely fault him. I mean, it sounded like he was acting out of ignorance more than out of malice. But
Well, yeah, and I'm not saying like the kid is like a card-carrying member of the GOP or something. But I do think like that attitude that it's okay to shoot gophers and, you do it for fun, right? It removes any sort of like emotional attachment to the gophers, obviously, right? They're just kind of out there for you to enjoy, you torture them or shoot them, kill them. And
sometimes they go and sometimes they eat them, right? Like, you fish, you go fishing, you catch a fish and you eat it. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that's what the hunters do. I guess, yeah, a lot of them do it for sport. Like, I don't know. I mean, I just, how is that any different from eating the meat that you buy at the grocery store? Like, I feel like that's the same level of, I don't know, irreverence for the animals, right?
Well, I think, I wasn't necessarily trying to say either side was better. One side was better than the other.
Yeah.
But I do think, as we kind of watch the country break down along these partisan lines, this attitude about nature is one of those divisions. I think especially on the left, you've seen like this acceleration of this idea that, factory farming is bad, GMOs are bad, the exploitation of nature that we engage in is bad.
Yeah.
And it's really become, especially for a certain set of vegans and environmentalists, it's a very powerful kind of identifier, right? To say that, you only buy certain foods, you only eat a certain way because you have this reverence for nature, and that is the moral position. I don't know. I think it's a really important part of our modern politics, and it's becoming more important as time goes on.
I thought that just crossed my mind. It almost seemed like the I guess you would call them the liberals, have assumed this kind of attitude of being custodians of the planet, so to
Yeah.
speak. Kind of like they've assumed the mantle of responsibility, where it's kind of like we are the most developed like entities on this planet, so we have to take responsibility for the direction things are headed, right? And I guess that is what kind of makes us different from all the other entities of nature that we've talked about today, right? It's kind of like none of them have gotten to the point where that they would potentially even think about things that way, right? Um, so like I guess I guess I guess I could start with kind of my personal view on this thing, which like if you were to put me into one of those camps of exploit versus not exploit the planet, I'd say I would fall more so in the former. Like I feel like we do live off this planet, and like we just need to make sure that our relationship with the planet kind of is sustainable, allow for sustainable exploitation, if you will, right? And I feel like, and that's where a lot of my sympathies or agreement with folks who want to protect and preserve the planet comes from. It's just kind of like you wouldn't kill the chicken to get an extra egg, right? Like, you know, you would let the chicken lay the eggs every day and kind of maintain that sort of relationship with the chicken, right? It's very clear that I'm exploiting the chicken by owning the chicken and taking its eggs every day. But I feel I'd kind of at a baseline kind of a mutual understanding, right? It's kind of like, you know, I'm taking your eggs, but I'll try to take care of you. And, you know, as long as you keep laying eggs, I'll keep taking care of you. And, you know, we just kind of coexist, right? In that way. It's not necessarily out of respect for the chicken, but it's kind of like I respect the chicken because it just works better this way, right? In the same way, like things about like concerns about kind of, you know, destroying the landscape, destroying the wildlife, right? If you don't give your nature a baseline level of respect, like it'll come back to bite you, right? Like a big problem in some parts of the world is because they cut down all the trees, like you have serious problems of desertification, right? Like, you know, the nature kind of fills roles that help you, right? If you don't respect the role that nature has and supporting your lifestyle, you know, it's going to come back and bite you. But I personally don't feel like I feel like it's a little bit, I don't want to say self-serving, but like we've kind of artificially created this elevation of ourselves to be the custodians of the planet, to kind of take that responsibility, right? It kind of implies that we're in control and to kind of be responsible and the deciders of the planet's fate. And I feel that in some ways that's unfounded. What do you guys think?
I think it's founded just because humans are the only species that can have a systemic impact on like life across the globe and the conditions of even the atmosphere, right? And no other animal can claim to be able to do that. So I think it's reasonable.
So like America should be the police of the world because it's the only one capable of doing it.
You know, I also actually do subscribe to that viewpoint. So yes.
Yeah, and I know you did. So I
yeah.
What it reminded me of.
Well, so I guess kind of taking a step back, the reason why I don't like that general idea of like we're now the custodians, it just kind of like it moves away from the actual action itself. It's circumstantial, right? Like me chopping these trees down or burning these forests, if humanity wasn't so far developed, it would all of a sudden be okay for me to treat nature in a particular way, right? But it's because I am aware and kind of developed that all of a sudden that same identical action is now all of a sudden bad and unacceptable, right? I feel like there's something getting like twisted along this way, right? Because if the action is the same, right, how come in one instance like it's bad and in the other instance it's kind of okay?
I think it's like a reaction to the tragedy of the commons, right? Like no one cared 500 years ago about Vikings chopping down trees to make boats, you know, because like there were plenty of trees relative to the number of Vikings. But nowadays, when we have 7 billion humans all demanding resources, I mean, you know, it's obvious, right? Like there's not enough to go around, or it can't, you know, if we just let everyone, you know, treat the commons, our shared resources with, you know, no restriction on their consumption, then the system will explode, right? It'll crumble. So, you know, as part of, I think, that pressure campaign to manage resources and make sure that the system is sustainable, we've had to not only have like economic incentives, but also like a social and moral incentive to, be good custodians of the earth, right? Just because otherwise things would go to shit.
Okay. Well, I have more talking points I want to bring up. Anything else that you guys had in mind with regards to this topic?
I don't know. I feel like we kind of strayed a little far from the initial idea of gardening and agriculture, but
no,
yeah,
I mean, it's all about the
it's good.
relationship between. I feel like the core idea is the relationship between us and nature, right?
Yeah,
and
I guess
with gardening and agriculture, that's probably the most direct way in most people's lives.
Yeah, I like the way you had to kind of describe it, right? It fits pretty cleanly. It's like agriculture is kind of our relationship with nature in terms of how we live off the land and exploit it, right? Whereas gardening, we're not expecting anything per se. It's just we like it being pretty. I'd say that's kind of the least malicious form of exploitation. Like I look upon you, I see beauty. Please don't say that I'm exploiting you.
That's a good point, and I guess that's the point that we haven't really hit on too much. We've really been talking about the exploitative side of the relationship between man and nature. Like, you mentioned that, with a garden, the benefit of it is ephemeral, right? Like you have the flowers, they look nice, but then every day they die a little bit more, then suddenly you just gotta throw them out. And it's like, oh well, shit, I have less for. But then I don't know, that reminded me of like going on a hike, right? You go on a hike because it's pretty, and like while you're on the hike, it's amazing. But then you just like leave the hike and you're done with it, and it's just kind of in the past now. The hike was still awesome, right? And it's like, those gardens were still awesome. I mean, you can take a picture and it'll last longer. It's like, I don't know, maybe that's a side of nature that the three of us can work through. I mean, I guess just kind of given this conversation, we seem to hone in on the exploitative nature between man and nature. So I don't know. Yeah, what do you guys think about that? Do you guys like going on hikes?
I do, yeah. I can appreciate nature, even if I don't consider myself I don't experience it much. Yeah. Yeah. But I also think at one point I did want to make, I guess, that kind of references an earlier part of the conversation, is that I think a lot of people's ideas of like what it means to respect nature and this entire idea of like living with nature and all of that it's kind of simplistic. I think a lot of people have a very flawed idea of what is good for nature and what living naturally means. And I guess this criticism is kind of geared towards like the anti-GMO group and the kind of people who are like, yeah, I really want to have like a big lawn where I can grow all my plants. Is that what we think when we think about like our impact on the environment as individuals? The solutions that we often go to are not actually what is good for the environment, right? Like we know that, yeah, like a lot of people think that living out in the suburbs and having like a nice big yard where they can grow a lot of plants is like making them one with nature, right? And they think that living among nature means that they're doing something good for nature. When in reality, that means you're living outside of a city and you have to drive everywhere, right? So you're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere to just go anywhere in the first place. The condition of your suburban neighborhood is not natural because they clear cut the entire forest that used to be there, and then the lawn is just a big patch of grass that isn't natural in the slightest because you mow it all the time and you use like fertilizer and pesticides to keep it looking green and like unnaturally neon green. And then when you live out in like this sprawling community, then it not only takes more resources for you to get anywhere yourself, but you have to build a lot of roads to transport things around that community, and other vehicles also have to move further, and you have to build more pipes and more electric lines, detached houses that, are just, like the detached suburban houses use more energy because they're not as well insulated. They're usually larger on average, So I think it's kind of ironic, right? Because a lot of people are very passionate about living in those sorts of communities. They think because my home is surrounded by greenery, that means I'm doing something good for the environment. And there's this idea that like places like Manhattan, where it's a concrete jungle and it's like incredibly artificial, and there's no remaining remnant of the natural landscape it used to be. We think of that as bad, right? We think of it as anti-nature. But the real pro-nature move is to actually kind of live in one of those environments. And, we want to collectively shrink the footprint of people on the landscape as much as possible. And that means living on top of each other, right? So, I think that's one thing that kind of bugs me, right, is this entire move towards gardening and and organic foods and like a self-sufficient lifestyle is not actually sustainable. If you think about what would be best for all of us to do for the environment. So
Is the average footprint of somebody who lives in the city less than somebody?
It is. Yeah.
Is it like the lowest? Is that like that's just like the best thing you can do? Like.
Yeah. I remember there's a few studies that are kind of interesting to look into this. One is like the energy. What's the name of the energy administration? Federal government. U.S. Department of Energy. It is the Department of Energy. They keep track of like energy usage in apartments versus single family homes. And it's like apartments use on average 1/2 to 2/3 the amount of electricity per year as a single family home does, because when you have units like attached to multiple sides, that's better insulated, right, than a home that's just kind of sitting out there by itself, being exposed to the outdoors on all sides.
Is this per square footage, or is it kind of
when controlling for area?
Okay.
Yeah. And then there have been studies on like CO2 footprint by location, and it turns out that the highest impact areas on carbon emissions are the suburbs of large cities, and the lowest impact areas are like the downtowns or urban cores of large cities. So Manhattan has an extremely low carbon footprint per person living there, while somewhere like Plano, unfortunately, is extremely high, right? And then actually people out in rural areas are even lower. They have lower carbon emissions than people in the suburbs, probably because they're more self-sufficient. But that kind of boundary case where it's like people who want to live out in a sprawling house, but also want to be near a city, they're kind of getting the worst of both worlds, right? Because they have to drive everywhere, but they don't have enough land to like be self-reliant. So I think again, like a lot of the discourse about this idea of being self-sufficient and sustainable is not really rooted in reality.
To your point earlier, Osmond, about like why we kind of like tilted our conversation towards the exploitation of nature, I feel like it's just because the other half of our relationship, the whole there's kind of passive appreciation aspect, or maybe proactively trying to preserve it. It's not really contentious, and that's why, like, if someone were to ask you, you think it's important to, preserve nature and respect it, like in a vacuum, I think that proposition on its own is not something that anyone would tend to disagree with, right? It's only when you kind of say, well, in order to achieve the preservation of nature, you have to give up X, Y, Z. That's when people really have like, that's like, no, I don't want to give that up for whatever. But kind of in a vacuum, it's like, do you like this idea that we have like beautiful national parks to go to, right? Like anyone would tell you, say, yeah, I mean, at the very least, they say, I don't really care, but it sounds fine, right? So like, as far as the discourse is concerned, it seems like naturally we have to, like, there's more to talk about when there's conflicting viewpoints and conflicting interests.
Yeah. That's a good point.
I think the point. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make in reference to your question of appreciation was that, like, what we think is an appreciation of nature, which for many people is living among it, is actually quite bad for nature.
Interesting. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, I guess my thought about that question was like maybe like as far as building general awareness and appreciation of the problems with sustainability that we have as a
Did he
human race.
cut off?
Oh, hello.
Osmond?
Hello. Hello. Oh.
Okay, you cut
am I
out
back?
for maybe a few seconds there.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking was like, sustainability is a big problem, like kind of for the human race moving forward. And so like I was thinking about ways to like, rally the forces. So I mean, like Kevin mentioned that like, if I lose the chicken, that's a pretty big problem. So I'm gonna have to like do what I should. I should do what I can to like take care of the chicken. But I mean, there's also another perspective in like, what if we admire the beauty of the chicken? Is that another way to sort of like get people to act um, and have them work to lower their carbon footprint in whatever is the most responsible way? So yeah, I guess like
Yeah.
This is in
I
some
think there's only
respects,
one way to do it. Like I think
move to the cities.
the only way to get people to, well, that's not what I was going to say. I was going to say the only way to get people to appreciate nature in their everyday lives or do what's best for nature is to make it more expensive to do what's worse for nature. Yeah.
To do, so I say that last part again?
The only way to get people to do what is in the interest of nature and the environment on an everyday basis is to make it more expensive to do the alternative, right?
Make it more expensive. Yeah, I guess so. But then, like, I don't know. Part of me hopes that maybe we can like, rally people by like looking at, admiring the beauty of nature, right? It's like some, kind of like make it,
Well,
right?
I will say
sometimes like a rousing speech is really what gets people going.
Yeah, and
Beautiful
I think
landscape.
those things that you're mentioning are often powerful enough to get people to go and vote for policies which make it more expensive to hurt the environment, right? So like national parks and others like parts of nature that people really value. If you keep emphasizing that, then people will rally around it. But the ultimate end goal is a set of policies that creates a monetary incentive for the people who are less likely to be swayed by the emotional incentives. And then everyone's on the same page.
Okay. Well, I really want to go on a hike soon. I haven't gone on one in so long. I don't know. It should be like safe to go now, right? There was a time when like everybody was going out on hikes and it was not safe.
I'm sure it's safe, especially now that we have like more evidence that being outdoors is pretty low risk, even if you are next to people.
Yeah. So that will be my way to appreciate nature. I hope you guys and any listeners here can also appreciate nature. But yes, I will conclude this episode. So thank you.